everyone, it's Katrina. Number 10. The Sea People. It's tough to find an ancient civilization more mysterious than the Sea People of the Bronze Age. They appeared in one of the most chaotic times in history. Egyptian pharaohs wrote of their invasions. When the Sea People showed up in the Mediterranean from parts unknown, societies fell like dominoes. Entire languages were obliterated, cultures disappeared as if they had never existed. Then, when the destruction and anarchy was over, the Sea People were gone. Nobody knows where they came from, and nobody knows where they went. The texts we have from ancient Egypt date back to the 13th century BC. There are multiple mentions of a group of naval raiders who began attacking cities and civilizations along the coastline of the Mediterranean. Their invasion was massive, with assaults happening in multiple regions. They terrorized the Hittites, the people of the Levant, and the Egyptians. Researchers believe it was the widespread violence of the Sea People that led to the collapse of the Bronze Age. One of the most famous encounters was between the Sea People and King Ramses II, also called Ramses the Great. He ruled Egypt from 1279 until 1213 BC. Historians know Ramses battled the Sea People because his victory against the mysterious civilization is inscribed in stone in ancient Egyptian ruins. If the writing is to be believed, he and his son, heir to the throne Meremptah, fought the Sea People, but other than discussing the battle, there isn't much information as to who they were. The Egyptian accounts claim they came from the north by the sea. They also mention territories named Luka, Ekwesh, Sheridan, and Teresh, yet there are no historical mentions of these places anywhere else. There are plenty of theories as to who the Sea People were, but none of them have been proven. Some say they came from the Aegean Sea and were part of an unknown Greek city-state. Others think they may have been a branch of the Philistines, the Etruscans, or the Minoans, but they may have been an entirely unknown people. The Sea People disappeared just as mysteriously as they materialized. After they were defeated at the hands of Ramses III in 1178 BC, all accounts of them stopped. Some believe they were absorbed into existing societies. However, like all aspects of the Sea People, this is just a theory. And now for number 9. But first, it's shout-out time. I want to give a big thank you to Joel Boyd for your generous super thanks.
Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe to join the Origins Explained family.
Number 9. The Khazars. Much like the Sea People, very little is known about where the Khazars came from. They were mostly nomadic people who started to establish their own empire in European Russia in the 6th century AD. The Khazars came out of nowhere and soon controlled most of the land between Russia and Kazakhstan, most of Ukraine, all the way down to Crimea. Their kingdom was immense and lasted for many decades. They were an integral part of history because it was their kingdom that acted as a buffer zone between the Byzantine Empire, predominantly Christian, and the Islamic caliphates. It's believed around the year 740, the king of the Khazars, along with the ruling class, converted to Judaism. Outside of Israel, the Khazars may have been the largest kingdom of Jews anywhere in the world. Researchers know the Khazars converted because there are sources from the Arab world, from the Byzantines, and from Jewish rabbis who lived 1,300 years ago. There were letters exchanged between King Joseph of the Khazars and Rabbi Hasdai ibn Shaprut from the 10th century. The rabbi was one of the central figures responsible for turning Spain into a Jewish safe haven very briefly in the 900s. His records show that he heard rumors of a Jewish state existing on the fringes of Europe. He then made contact with the Khazars and began correspondence with their ruler. King Joseph explained to the rabbi that he and his people gave up their pagan beliefs to accept Judaism. However, the entire population wasn't exactly on board. It was mostly the king and his noblemen who were coaxed by Jewish scholars who journeyed to their domain as missionaries. Then they were destroyed. At the end of the 10th century, the rulers of the Byzantine Empire made an alliance with the European Russians. They used their combined forces to annihilate the kingdom of the Khazars. The capital of Atil was burned to the ground. Their lands were devastated, and nobody's really sure what happened to them after. The Khazars weren't completely destroyed, but they were forced to disperse. Many of their descendants supposedly fled to Spain. It's believed their bloodline still exists somewhere in the world.
Hi Hi guys! Excuse the brief interruption, but I just wanted to let you all know that we are now on Spotify. Origins Explained is now available on the free Spotify app and Spotify.com, so you have even more ways to join us. Listen and follow along for new episodes every week. Check out the link in the description box and be sure to share with your friends, your family, your mom, your teacher, your neighbor. You get it. See you there.
Number 8. The Moche Civilization. Starting around the year 100 AD, the Moche civilization became the dominant cultural force in northern Peru. Their influence was incorruptible up until around 700. That was when their culture abruptly collapsed for no apparent reason. The Moche were either an entire empire or only a powerful city-state. Scholars aren't sure which one. They did have administrative districts in each of their mighty cities and a shared culture. They were excellent at working metal, shaping pottery, and growing crops. Their society truly did thrive, but they were spread out to such an extent it's difficult to say if they were a single entity. At the very least, there may have been the northern Moche with their own laws and their own capital. Then there may have been the southern Moche with their own system of government as well. They lived in places that are now ruins, such as the Huacas del Sol heritage site. The Moche loved art, but their art has been the source of a lot of controversy in modern times. They had a bizarre obsession with death and human bodily fluids. Many of the most skilled examples of pottery work depict things like urine, snot, and blood. Many of their artwork also shows vivid scenes of romantic entanglement between members of the same sex. The Moche were also obsessed with slavery, ritual sacrifice, and war. Many of their works of art show how violence and brutality played a huge role in their civilization. Maybe it was warmongering that brought them to an end. Researchers have found that starting around 700 AD, there was a big shift in Moche artwork. They began focusing primarily on war. They also began to build many more military fortresses. There was clearly some kind of tension, likely with an outside party. War was likely a factor, and there also may have been an intense El Niño event that caused a weather disaster, followed by the volcanic winter of 536 AD. It's unclear exactly what happened, but it likely involved starvation, pestilence, warfare, and death. Number 7. The Viking Extinction. The Viking Age began in 700 AD and came to an end in 1100 AD. But what became of the Vikings when their glorious age of pillaging and raiding came to an end? To understand the end, it's important to understand their beginnings. The Vikings came from Scandinavia. They were an extremely diverse people who hailed from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Something happened in the 8th century that caused the northern folk to explode outward. They began to explore, trade, and settle to new lands. They also took to raiding the relatively peaceful lands of Europe's coastline, primarily Ireland, England, France, Scotland, and Russia. They found an easy way of collecting treasure by attacking defenseless monasteries all over Europe. The Vikings were hardly Christian and didn't care about sacrilege. They would cruise up and down the coast looking for easy targets to attack. But not all Vikings used boats. Many Vikings traveled by foot across Russia to pillage as far as Constantinople. Vikings even showed up in Iraq. They made what was likely the first European settlement in North America when they landed in Canada 1,000 years ago. The first official raid was in Anglo-Saxon territory in 787 AD. They pillaged haphazardly until the creation of the Great Heathen Army in 865. The formation of the Great Viking Army allowed the Vikings to challenge the Anglo-Saxon kings of England and even lay siege to Paris. The Vikings were certainly remarkable in the fact that they were never truly defeated. They were never destroyed like other civilizations. The Viking Age only came to an end because their power was so immense that they had settled in almost every part of Europe. The Vikings never died. They did the unimaginable and integrated into the broader European community. Europe is the way it is today because of the Vikings. Their blood can be found in just about every corner of the globe. Number 6. The Ghana Empire and the Lion King. The Mali Empire was founded by a man named Sundiata Keita. His people called him the Lion King. He began as the leader of a small, obscure tribe inside the Ghana Empire. But when Ghana began its decline in the 13th century AD, the Lion King rose up to seize power. He gathered a force big enough to subdue the Ghana Empire and start his own. Most of what history remembers about the Lion King comes from stories passed down from generation to generation. Many of his tales are also logged in the text called the Epic of Sundiata. According to his legend, the Lion King was the son of King Magan Kon Fata, who ruled a small piece of Guinea. There was supposedly a prophecy which foretold Magan's descendants would rule a great kingdom. But the only way the prophecy could be fulfilled was if Magan agreed to marry the most hideous woman among his people. She was terribly disfigured and had a hump on her back. Her eyes were too terrible to look at. Thinking about the future of his people, Magan agreed to marry the ugliest woman in creation. Then, fast forward to when his boy became a man, Sundiata Keita founded the Mali Empire. The empire grew and prospered under the rulership of the Lion King. The area had a significant amount of gold, which brought in hordes of wealth from outside civilizations. The sheer number of Muslim merchants who entered the capital helped to spread Islam into Africa. When the king died in 1255, the empire did not die with him. The Mali Empire continued until the 17th century. In 1670, the Bamana Empire conquered the Mali. The entire kingdom was ruined and disintegrated almost overnight. After almost 500 years, the people reverted back into tribes ruled over by independent provincial chiefs. Number 5. The Ancient Toltecs. Around 900 AD, the Toltec civilization emerged as the dominant force in central Mexico. They ruled from their capital city of Tula for about 150 years before the city was destroyed and the Toltec vanished into obscurity. They were legendary sculptors and great warriors. Much like the Christians in Europe, the Toltec were bent on spreading their religion across all their known territories. They didn't have Christianity, but rather the cult of Quetzalcoatl. This was a religion dedicated to the greatest god in their pantheon, the feathered serpent. The Toltec army was a force of religious warriors who had an obsession with animals. They organized their ranks based on fearsome beasts. For example, their legendary jaguar warriors. They wielded curved blades, small shields, and throwing darts that could pierce a man's heart. Much like the Aztec that came after them, the Toltec civilization was big on human sacrifice. Man or child, they didn't care who was killed as long as it would appease their gods. Archaeologists have found the remnants of the very vessels that were used in human sacrifice. The Toltec used gigantic bowls for slaughtering the innocent in their main city. In their central plaza, archaeologists uncovered an ancient skull rack upon which the severed heads of sacrifice victims were placed in celebration. Everything was going fine until 1150. That was when Tula was sacked and burned. The massive mystery is that archaeologists don't know why. They know the city was burned because they found the ruins of palaces with charred stone, showing the buildings were clearly set on fire. But nobody knows who burned the city down. The Toltecs were wildly aggressive and practiced barbaric violence. The destruction of their city was most likely from one of the neighboring tribes, or a rising state who had had enough. Some think it may have been the Chichimeca tribes who finally put down the Toltecs, but nobody knows. Number 4. The Anasazi Wastes. In the 1,000 years before Christopher Columbus arrived in North America, the Anasazi civilization ruled the American Southwest. They're not as famous as the Mayans. The ruins they left behind aren't as imposing or impressive, but researchers say they were just as advanced and sophisticated as the Mayans. Then, without warning, out of the blue, the Anasazi left the American Southwest. They were gone forever. The last few vestiges of their power remain baking under the hot desert sun, but the people are nowhere to be found. Some of the ruins are huge. The Anasazi built massive ceremonial chambers with ceilings weighing up to 90 tons. They were in the canyons and the valleys. They chiseled massive staircases in the sides of stone cliffs by hand using only hammers and stone tools. Evidence has been found that the Anasazi traded with other civilizations far to the south. The remains of exotic birds from the Mexican jungles have been found here, suggesting the birds were brought on caravans by Anasazi merchants or traders from the Maya Empire. The Anasazi were here from a time no scientist can agree. That said, they did most likely arrive around the year 300. 1,000 years later, in 1275, all building projects stopped. Within the next 25 years, every last member of the society had fled. They don't appear to have been under attack. They were in the midst of building roads and monuments. Archaeologists don't even think they had any enemies. The only thing that makes sense is drought. Scientists suggest that just as the Anasazi reached their peak, They were devastated by an unprecedented drought. Malnourishment crippled the villages and civil war broke out. Settlements crumbled to ruin as the springs went dry. With no crops and no drinking water, the Anasazi fled in all directions, desperate just to survive. Number 3. The Etruscan failure. Before the Romans, there was a civilization called the Etruscans. They flourished in Italy starting in the 8th century BC, but by the time the 3rd century BC rolled around, they had been completely assimilated by the much more powerful Roman civilization. Scientists think it might have been because the Etruscans were pushovers. They wanted to party, create art, and have fun. The Romans wanted to conquer. The trouble with understanding a civilization from 2,800 years ago is that you need proof of what they were like, preferably in the form of writing. The Etruscans didn't leave behind extensive written texts of their history. All historians know about them is what was written by the Romans, who were obviously not a trusted source. There is also what remains of their culture to understand them, but it's not much. The Romans completely took over Italy. Any Etruscan cities or monuments were reused or destroyed by the Romans. There are still some murals and pieces of artwork that haven't been forgotten. Researchers have been able to determine, based strictly on tomb paintings, that the Etruscan cities were often at war with one another. Rather than forming a united front, the party-hardy Etruscans were selfish. Every city only looked out for its best interests, regardless of their neighbors. When the Sicilians began to attack the southernmost Etruscan cities, those cities were likely not assisted by the ones in the north. Then migrating Celts in the 5th century BC started attacking the Etruscans from the north. Suddenly, they had the Sicilians, the Romans, and the Celts on all frontiers. The selfish way of life for the Etruscans led to their downfall. Still, there is a lot the experts don't know. For example, it took many centuries for the Etruscans to be defeated. It's unclear why, but the best guess is that they must not have been as weak as the Romans wrote in their history books. In the 6th century BC, Etruscan king Q.C. Lars Porsena even attacked Rome in an effort to rid Italy of the rapidly rising Romans. For over 200 years, war was fought in every part of Italy for domination of the land. Maybe things would have been different if the Etruscan cities had formed a truce between them, but that wasn't what happened. In the end, it's believed the Etruscans willingly joined Rome against the Gauls in 225 BC. The Etruscans, after that, were gradually absorbed into the new Roman world. Number 2. The Chinese Atlantis. China has its own legendary city of Atlantis, only it's called Sanxingdui, and nobody knows where it came from. The city was founded in 1986 in the Sichuan Basin. A couple of farmers stumbled upon a cache of jade artifacts that hadn't been seen in over 3,000 years. Within a single weekend, the site was swarmed by archaeologists from several teams. Over the next 30 years, archaeologists would reveal sacrificial pits containing the lost relics of an unknown civilization. They lived 5,000 years in the Bronze Age, but there is no historical record of them anywhere, except in the bones of their forgotten city. Archaeologists have discovered elephant tusks and huge ceremonial bronze human heads. There are masks covered in gold and even remains of sacrifice victims. All the evidence points to a hugely advanced civilization. They had a complex religion, but scientists don't know anything about it. Experts believe this city may have been part of the mythical kingdom of Shu, but no one's ever been able to prove it. The city of Sanxingdui, despite being the most important archaeological site in China, still hasn't made it on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Number 1. Mycenae. The Mycenaean civilization was one of the greatest of the Bronze Age. They emerged around 1700 BC and peaked within 200 years. Then they prospered for another 2 centuries. The decline started in the 13th century and was complete by 1100 BC. The Mycenaeans were not the only civilization in Greece, but they did rule the lands across the Aegean Sea. Their rulership remained inside their capital city of Mycenae on the island of Crete. They were influenced by a much earlier civilization that also used Crete as their home base. The previous civilization was the Minoans. who lasted from 2000 until 1450 BC. It's likely the Minoans were assimilated into the Mycenaeans, but how it all happened is unknown. The religious practices were very similar. They built similar architecture and their artwork was almost identical, but the Mycenaeans were far more militaristic. Their armies dominated mainland Greece through sheer force. They also established trading lines with Egypt and the Levant. It was the Mycenaeans who wrote stories about all your favorite Bronze Age heroes, such as Achilles and Odysseus. The Mycenaeans were the ones who went to war against Troy and destroyed the city. The decline and ultimate destruction of the Mycenaean civilization coincided with the appearance of the Sea People. They began to lose power around 1230 BC and were gone within a century. Scientists know, based on physical evidence, that many of their cities were obliterated in a short span of 50 years. There appears to have been some kind of dramatic chaos that saw the Mycenaeans be taken down, one city at a time. Many historians believe these Sea People were directly responsible. These Sea People were notorious naval bandits. Since the Mycenaean cities were all on islands or hugging the coast, it would have been easy for the unfathomable hordes of the Sea People to casually destroy them one city after the next. Thanks for watching! Which lost civilization do you find the most fascinating? What would you like to learn more about? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already and come back soon. See you later. Bye!